At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Back in 2020, Mo Wilde made a quiet but radical pledge to herself as she set out to complete what many of us would think impossible. A promise to survive for a whole year solely on wild foraged food found within a 5-mile radius of her home in Scotland. Mo's brilliant book, The Wilderness Cure, documents the study that she took part in and the deep connections she has forged with the natural world and our ancestral past as a result of it. Our chat covers Mo's love and personal memories of trees, her insights on what a truly healthy diet looks like, and how this is totally entwined with our wider environment, how we look after it, and how we understand it. Mo, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Thanks so much for giving your time to chat to me. And I've got to kick off with the first question, which is, Mo, what do trees mean to you?
Gosh, trees are incredible beings. Without them, we would be nothing on this planet. There'd be little food, little shade. They seem to connect everything together. They're guardians. They're very, very old, many of them. And we're only just beginning to scratch the surface in how they relate to each other. When you start to follow the work of people like, Suzanne Simard, it's just incredible. Some people will go along and, walk past a tree and it's just sort of, to them, a big inanimate lump. Whereas, to me, they are very, very alive beings and ecosystems in their own right, so many of them too.
And what would you say they mean to you personally? So where did your own journey begin with trees and understanding and growing that appreciation for them that you've clearly got?
Well, going right back to childhood, I think, instantly when you think of going right back to childhood, there are specific trees that immediately jump into mind. So when I was about 4 or 5, there was a laburnum tree in the garden with beautiful yellow flowers. But I remember being told to be very careful not to eat them because they were poisonous. I was in quite awe of that tree, that it had this sort of power. And then when I was about 6, going on 7, we moved to Kenya. And the first tree that springs to mind there was a huge kapok tree that shaded the lawn in front of the house. But when it dropped its kapok seed cases, if you missed them, there'd be tiny little spikes. So you had to really watch out for your feet. But all the pillows and the cushions would be stuffed with kapok. And then there were these avocado trees, which are like huge forest trees. They're a huge size. And they lined an old and very disused tennis court. And when the avocados dropped down, they were like these huge green bombs. So those are some of the sort of, the early trees. More recently, I discovered this incredible beech tree recently, which has grown in a way where it's almost as if some have grown together and become so fused that they've ended up as one tree. But it's almost like you had this frieze of dancing figures about it. I was looking at a photograph of it again just yesterday and thinking, my goodness, it's almost like you can see this, Grecian spirits in relief dancing around the trees in this shape.
I love that. Great imagery you're painting there. Are there any kind of smells or aromas from those special trees that you mentioned, something that really takes you back in time? And do you ever sort of come across those kind of scents nowadays?
Well, you're spanning continents there. And I think in some ways the scent that I most associate with trees is the smell from underneath them, which is probably more the scent of the earthy, musky nature of the soil that has been enriched by so many generations of fallen leaves, rather than the actual tree itself, except for those that produce, resins like the lodgepole pine or the Douglas fir, in great quantities. And then you can just, put your nose into it and, there's whiffs of frankincense and the exotic amongst the resin.
Yeah, it can be quite intoxicating if you're in a stand that's particularly sappy. And it's like that almost a strong citrusy smell, isn't it? That really invigorates the senses and perks you up a little bit.
Well, they do appeal to the senses. I mean, a lot of people don't know that you can eat some of the tree leaves. And there's a particular window in May, the first 2 weeks of May, it is in Scotland, where the young beech leaves come out and they're soft and silky and vibrant green. And they taste slightly lemony. And you have the most delicious salads where you wouldn't even dream of going and looking for lettuce. You've just got endless beech leaves. There's a gorge called Rumbling Bridge out in Perthshire. And when you walk there, you descend into the gorge. And that time in spring, you look up and everything above you is just lit with this almost fluorescent green. And it's like being in West Lothian or the Kingdom of the Elves down there. I like being a giraffe and just going along and nibbling them straight off the trees.
What's the landscape like where you live?
Well, I'm in central Scotland. If you join up the dots between Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Stirling and put a dot in the middle, I'm in what I like to call the Bermuda Triangle of disappearing countryside. So it's part agricultural. There's a lot of fields with improved grass, which basically just means monospecies of ryegrass. But there are still beech and hawthorn hedges, some of them very gapped, like an old lady with gappy teeth, because they're not looked after very well. And above me is an area of what's called wet heath habitat. So very windswept and lots of reeds and young birch colonizing them. And then rowans, which give food for the winter. So it's quite an exposed, sometimes slightly desolate landscape. Around us, there's lots of building sites, new buildings going on. And a few decades ago, there was a lot of mining. But I love it.
Yeah, it sounds like quite a lot of contrasts going on, which I think always help you to appreciate the different elements of a landscape.
There are a lot of different elements. I mean, when I came here, there were still, patches of woodland where you could disappear and not hear traffic. Now, more recently, it's become overshadowed by installation of lots of wind turbines. So you hear this whoosh, whoosh, whoosh all the time, and sort of cranking and clanking of the wind turbines. And when you're walking amongst the trees looking for mushrooms, there's this kind of light strobe effect as the shadow of the turbines sweep over the land. So the character of the place has changed a lot in the name of progress.
Coming back to those formative experiences you were describing with trees, I wonder if there was someone in your life that perhaps nurtured that appreciation, or someone that you think of when you think back to those times.
Well, I had a slightly strange upbringing. That I was the eldest of 5 children, all born within 6 years of each other. So my parents had a lot on their hands. And, as the eldest, you're sort of expected a little bit more to fend for yourself. And, we moved countries. And then when I was 8 or 9, I was sent back to the UK to go to a boarding school. That's what people did in those days, sent their children away. So I didn't have a huge amount of, adults in my life that did things with me. When I was little, we lived near a Kikuyu village, and I spent a lot of time with the Kikuyu and learned a lot about plants and herbs that way. But I'm trying to think. I think my encounters with trees were really quite solitary. There wasn't really a big influence, but there was always a tree of note. One house I remember right by the gate, there was this incredible jacaranda tree with these purple blossoms. And I went to Namibia last year and immediately recognized this incredible color and, bursts of color in these jacaranda trees. And then sometimes, when we went, on holiday, you'd encounter baobab trees, which are absolutely incredible. They have the same presence that the old oaks do here. So I've always been drawn to these trees, which really announce themselves by their own presence in your life.
I'm loving these exotic examples of trees, and my imagination's certainly wandering off talking to you. And I guess speaking to you as well, and that point of reflection you made there about perhaps trees and your relationship with them being more of a personal thing than something that's been guided by others. Maybe that takes us on quite nicely to the subject of the Wildbiome project, and again, extending that capacity around self-reliance maybe, and I suppose trees playing a part of that. I wonder if you might just give a bit of an overview of that project, and where did it start and how did you get involved?
Well, it really came out of my attempt to live only on wild food for a year. It sounds like a pretty crazy sort of thing to do, but I've been teaching foraging for the best part of 2 decades now. One of those career choices that you don't make at school, but you fall into accidentally during life. And one of the questions people would always ask me is, well, it's all very well telling us that, cleavers is related to coffee and you can make a coffee substitute from the seed and so on. You can eat these dandelion leaves and things, but could you actually live exclusively on wild food? And, I did. And, as you know, my book, The Wilderness Cure, records that. But at the end of it, having tested my gut microbiomes throughout the year, I found that I couldn't find anybody in the scientific community to help me analyze it and understand what the impact of these results was. These gut microbes that moved around and went up and down and disappeared from having been there, and then some would appear that had never been in my gut before. And the general opinion at the time was that most people's gut microbiome in its indigenous state remains fairly static and constant, but mine was moving around all over the place. And, at the end of that, I realized that just because two of us had had really interesting results without a control and without any scale, it didn't really mean anything to anybody. Maybe we were just two weirdos. So, I had this idea that if we got a group and we could find a control and we could raise the money to do the tests, it would be a really valuable thing to do. And through a chance meeting enabled by Dan Saladino from the BBC Food Programme, who's a lovely chap and had his own book out at the time, he introduced me to Tim Spector, who agreed that Zoe, the Human Microbiome Project, would support us. So through the Association of Foragers, which was set up in 2015 to encourage people teaching foraging to adopt common standards around sustainability and safety, and also to provide community and friendship, as well as a visible presence as a community. I was able to then convince 24 people, including myself, that living only on wild food would be a good thing. So we halved the group. 12 people did it for just 1 month, just to see how quickly changes would happen. And 12 people did it for 3 months. And we tested everybody's gut microbiome at the beginning and the end, and their blood sugar response to fats. And we also did, obviously measured everybody's weight and BMI and their waist and waist to height ratio. We looked at cholesterol and basic vitamins, and did checks on things like hormones, just to make sure that, people were staying stable and not being put at risk. And yeah, that's how it all started, really. And people have been really interested, which is great. In some ways, it's raised even more questions that need answering. So we're planning on running it again in 2025. And lots of people are emailing in asking to be put on the list to be notified about when it's going to start. So it's very exciting.
And what role did trees play in that project and how successful it was?
Well, when you look at the macronutrients, there are three sort of main categories. There's proteins, obviously, fats, and then carbohydrates, which include sugars and starches. And fats and carbohydrates are the fuels of the body. Our bodies are a little bit like dual fuel cars. They can switch over between one or the other. And in the Scottish diet, and I would say in general in the British diet, trees are the most important source of carbohydrates. When you think of living on wild food, people would say, oh, well, you've got things like roots and tubers. And to a certain extent, yes, if you go down to southern Africa into the desert, you'll find these enormous tubers. You can look in, any book on southern African wild foods and see pictures of people, with huge smiles holding a tuber the size of a small baby, because for 6 months of the year, they have to be underground, storing water and sugars and starches until the rains come again in 6 months' time. But over here, there's plenty of rain. And so they tend to be quite thin and wiry and really gripping and holding on to the rocks. You don't get these great, big, huge underground storage organs, as they're called. So the provision by trees of nuts and fruits is really critical, and particularly hazelnuts, the hazel trees. And that goes right back to the sort of late Mesolithic times. There would be people would get together, small tribes that would split out for subsistence, would come together at harvest time, forming huge communities and go gathering hazelnuts and then bring them all back to one place. I would imagine that the very agile, young men and women would go and climb the trees and shake all the nuts down and haul them around. And the old people like me would just be sitting around, cracking them between stones and shelling them, cracking nuts and cracking jokes. And then they would all be shared out again. And that was absolutely essential for getting people through the winter, for example. And then acorns from the oak tree, another really important source of energy and carbohydrate. Obviously, they take a bit more processing because they're very high in tannins, so they have to be leached out. Just those two trees could make the difference between life and death over a winter.
I'm wondering, of the foods that you sampled and survived on during the project, were there any that were particularly tasty, or perhaps some that were really not that pleasant, but you just had to get it down you? Which ones come to mind?
Well, your taste buds change. I mean, a lot of people, for instance, would find rowan very tart. Well, I've got a friend who's been foraging for many years who hates anything made of rowan because he says it tastes like and smells of sick. But, I love their tartness. And they only need, a little bit of honey just to bring them back within the palate range. You've got things like, hawthorn, which can either be a, tree or a hedging plant. Very often you see them as hedges as well. Hedges are really just bonsai trees. And, a lot of these hedgerow fruits and tree fruits would not necessarily have been eaten in the summer like cherries, but none of them would have gone to waste. So they would have been made into things like pontac and, brown sauces, cooked up and then pushed through meshes as brown sauces. And they would continue to provide you with a really important source of, vitamins through the winter. But without processing, they can be, quite tart, to say the least. If you've ever tried to eat a sloe from a blackthorn tree rather than sloe gin, it'll really make your face pucker up.
Yeah, I thought it looks like a blueberry. I know you can have it in gin, but yeah, definitely it wasn't pleasant. Really kind of dried the mouth out. The other ones personally that I've eaten more regularly would be those fresh beech leaves that you mentioned, hawthorn leaves, and also hawthorn berries as well, which are quite tart, but they're almost like a mini apple. But yeah, I guess you need quite a lot of these things though, don't you, to sort of sustain you for a day, a week, or even a season, I guess. How did you ensure you had enough to go round?
I didn't really ensure that I had enough. I was a bit blasé about going into it, really because of the person that I am. I tend to always have the best intentions about planning and then jump in at the deep end anyway. So the sensible thing would have been to have waited a full year deliberately and conscientiously keeping things. But, I thought I'd probably got enough to get me through the winter, and I just jumped in. What I very quickly learned, though, is that there's an incredible abundance out there. And just on the subject of tree leaves, you mentioned hawthorn as well, but what about European lime tree, linden leaves? They're amazing because they have a much longer period of harvesting. The ones that grow near the base of the trunk can go on for months. And then, of course, you've got the flowers, which are wonderful in teas, very calming and have a beautiful taste to them. And then the seeds, which if you catch them at exactly the right stage and grind them up and toast them and grind them up, you can actually make something that tastes a little bit like Nutella out of them. They're incredible gifts. And of course, there's sap. Many of the trees can be tapped for sap in the spring. Most people will have heard of maple syrup. And of course, we've got field maple here, but there are some other, Norwegian maples and other maples that have been introduced around. But people don't realize that things like the sycamore tree is also a member of that family. And you can get sycamore sap out and drink it, like you would birch sap as a spring tonic. Or if you do boil them up and reduce them right down, you can make syrups and, with sycamore even crystallize it into sugar.
How did you find the experience overall? Because it must have taken a lot of self-discipline, and I would imagine there would have been some challenging moments in there in trying to maintain integrity to what you were trying to achieve.
No, you're absolutely right, because I have virtually no self-discipline at all, believe it or not. And so I have to put in place things that discipline me. So one of the things that I did was to post everything I ate on Instagram. So there was, a small army of followers out there ready to notice if I skipped a meal or if I sneaked something in that I shouldn't have. Even more importantly than that was that because I was testing my gut microbiome, I knew that if I cheated, I was going to upset the results of the gut microbiome tests. For one slip up, a whole season of eating wild could be wasted. So that was a really good motivating factor. And the other thing is also that once you get past the first, week in particular, but once you get into your rhythm with it, you don't actually miss so many of the other things. I had one slip up, which involved a piece of lemon drizzle cake, which I wasn't proud of. But I had actually, at that point, been helping a friend of mine who was having a home birth, and the hospital switchboard had gone down and the midwife didn't come out. So I had been, helped to deliver her baby. And when the neighbour brought round some lemon drizzle cake, when none of us had eaten for about 36 hours, I was tempted to celebrate the new arrival with a piece of cake and felt extremely guilty straight afterwards.
Quite recently, I went to the Eden Project, and there was a fantastic exhibition there about hidden worlds. And one of those was about microbes and the human body. And a couple of kind of facts that stuck with me were that microbes outnumber our own cells 10 to 1 and our own genes 100 to 1. And also that at birth, we are pretty much 100% human cells. And of course, at death, we are 0% and we are 100% microbial. We become one with the microbes. And so it was just a really big reminder about humans not being a single entity. You could even describe us as a mini ecosystem, if you like. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about ultra processed foods and a diet that's far from ideal and far from our origins.
I'm surprised it's as little as 10 to 1, because I remember seeing a diagram once where if you took all of our cells out and took the water and air out and refilled the human cells into a model of ourselves, we'd only come up, halfway up the calf of one foot on one leg. So I tend to think of us, each one of us, as being a little universe where there's this thriving population of bacteria, of viruses, of phages, of fungal organisms, and then human cells. And the thing that keeps it all in balance is, the immune system, sort of almost like Jedi Force in this universe. And for the most part, in a healthy human ecosystem, everything is living in balance, even the E. coli that we all have, even the Staphylococcus aureus that we all have, even the Klebsiella that most of us have. But if they get out of control, if there's an uprising on those microbial planets within us, then everything goes awry. And another factor which is worth considering is that around the roots of a plant or a tree, particularly around the fine root structure of trees, there are also these huge colonies of microbes as well. And guess what? The rhizobiome, as it's called, rhizo being root, the rhizobiome of most plants contains the same bacteria that we have in our gut microbiomes. And although the emphasis at the moment is on the gut microbiome, there's also a respiratory biome, a lung biome, an ENT biome, a skin microbiome, a genital microbiome. And if what is outside is also within us, the difference between our digestive system and something like fungi, for instance, fungi are thin and fibrous, their body is ephemeral, like the polyester wadding inside a duvet, is that they have to go with their little fibers through the soil because they're ejecting acids and enzymes to break down the food around them. Whereas we put our food inside ourselves and then squirt it with acids and enzymes. So we're kind of like donuts. There's skin on the outside with the microbiome, and then we have this sort of epithelial skin or lining on the inside, and everything that's outside goes through the middle of us and out the other end. So in some ways, we take the world within us, whether we're breathing or eating or drinking, and it interacts with those that are resident within us. And when you start to realize that, you start to understand how, as we destroy the external ecosystem around us, so we are threatening our internal ecosystems. It's no accident that a lot of the more chronic degenerative diseases that come from diet, whether it's the malnutrition of poverty or the malnutrition of obesity, they're both forms of malnutrition. Some of the long chronic fatigue diseases, even some of the muscular weaknesses that come from the inability of the stomach to transform and uptake nutrients into the body. There's so much interconnection between our internal and external ecosystems, and we ignore that at our peril.
It's a big thought to get your head around, isn't it?
Yeah. But if we forget that we are part of this planet and part of this system and continue to act as if we're just, living superficially on top of it all and it doesn't matter what's beneath our feet, if we don't change that view, well, everyone can see what's happening around us.
How did you find the return to something more like a typical diet? Or have you returned to a more typical diet since the experiment?
I can't return to a typical diet because if I do, I just immediately start putting weight on again. So I have to try to keep as much wild food in my diet as possible. And it does take more organization, the effort of organization, which is hard when you're also juggling projects and working and, when you've got a foot in both worlds. When you look at the actual time, if you're willing to spend one day at the weekend going out a little bit further or, a bigger crop of whatever it is you're after at the time, then normally you can get by during the week just spending about an hour and a half a day doing foraging and food preparation and a little bit of cooking, but you just have to be organized. And I tend to get very, I go into hyper focus and get very wrapped up in things. And then suddenly it's like, so it'd be much easier within a community of people where you took it in turns to be the ones going out harvesting things. So, of course, we always used to live in communities and not these little nuclear units.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I try my best to eat a healthy diet, and I'm definitely aware that plant diversity is a really big factor in increasing our gut health. And yet sometimes, perhaps you might be traveling somewhere and all there are service stations. If you haven't brought something pre-prepared with you, it can be difficult to make the right choices.
Yes, very much so. And of course, during the 3 months of the Wildbiome project, I did quite a bit of traveling. So I was doing some courses down in the South Coast. And you had to be really well prepared, making sure that you had nuts, thank you, trees, and dried fruits, thank you, trees and shrubs. And then some pemmican or some jerky, some dried up meat, and maybe some, feral apple, dried feral apple. But if you didn't have those, yeah, I mean, it's a food desert when it comes to nutrition. So many places, real food deserts. And what you find is that when you're eating wild food, it's much more nutrient dense. On average, a dandelion, for instance, has 3 times more vitamin A than spinach. And certainly when you're eating them, what you find is that the food is so nutrient dense that quite small amounts satisfy you very quickly. And I was reading some of the research recently that said, we have these different sensors for the macronutrients, and the one that overrides all the others is protein. So if you don't eat enough protein, you'll continue to feel hungry and eat and eat and eat until that protein craving is satisfied. So on a wild food diet, you can actually have quite a small meal and feel very full and very satisfied and go for a long time without having to snack or dip into it. Whereas if you sit down to something that is not got a lot in it, I don't know, macaroni cheese, you could probably eat 3 helpings.
Are there any supermarket products at the moment that you think come anywhere near to the wild food options that you've explored?
Well, to be honest, I've probably only been in a supermarket about 2 or 3 times in the last year. They're not something that I use, except if the cat is having an emergency. And the cat ought to be able to fare perfectly well on wild food, except that we've got a mutual agreement that if I feed it cat food, it won't eat birds.
Sounds like a fair deal.
Yeah, it's a bit ironic considering it's a wild cat. Or a feral cat, actually. It's not a like Scottish wild cat, but it's certainly a very feral cat that adopted us. So it's quite funny that it's the reason for going to the supermarket. It's difficult. I mean, obviously, a lot of supermarkets would have things like watercress, rocket. They don't stock acorn flour. Do they stock chestnut flour? I suppose they're starting to stock more nut flours, things like almond flour. And they do stock nuts. And apples. The apples in the supermarket are much bigger and juicier and, well, more watery than the feral apples. Apple trees, as they grow from seed, not one of them will grow the same as its sibling seeds or necessarily anything like its parents. And I've heard that in Kazakhstan, which is where apples originated, you have these huge forests, and some of the apple trees can be incredibly tall. And you have these huge forests of apple trees where no one looks the same, which must be an amazing place to visit.
Yeah, you're making me want to go there for sure. I've got a bit of an out there question for you. So let's imagine let's keep this light. So a zombie apocalypse. Let's say that, the general support systems we've got for food, etc., broke down, and we would then be relying on more basic skills to survive. Where would you advise people to begin?
Gosh, how much time have they got with this? How much warning have they got for the zombie apocalypse? I think it's important that people know, because if these skills are forgotten, then our children will never learn them. And in the UK, we have this strange attitude to foraging. We tend to think of it as niche, something that hipsters do, or middle class people do, or people with barbers and wellies, or chefs. 50% of the people in this world, globally, derive either their food or some of their income from wild produce. And in areas where there's a lot of poverty, 70%. In many cities in the world, people use their, basic minimal wages to buy carbohydrates, to buy corn or maize or rice, and they still rely on foraging for anything that gives them nutrition. So it is actually something that is commanding more attention now. I'm actually writing a paper for a book that looks at global wild food and sustainable development goals. Because when you look at farming, it's changed so much now. There are no longer traditional farms as evolved from the Neolithic, but these are huge, huge areas where people are excluded from the land and crops are grown on a large scale. But when you look at farming, you have to spend a huge amount of time breaking up and preparing the soil and denuding it of weeds. And then you grow a crop that normally needs lots of inputs. They need fertilizer. In the dry season, they'll need water. They need pesticides. They need constant weeding. And most of the crops that are grown on those sorts of scale are carbohydrate, that traditionally were only eaten in the winter. Whereas the weeds that will grow amongst them, the chickweeds, the fat hens, the sorrels, these require no inputs. You don't have to do anything. They just grow all by themselves, and they're adapted to tougher conditions, so they will survive drought and all the rest of it. So these are the foods, also being super nutrients that in many parts of the world are easier to resource on a larger scale than some of the crop farming. So to answer your question, although in Britain we tend to have this sort of view of it being quite niche, nevertheless, when it comes to sort of food security, it's an essential skill. If our villages or towns were suddenly surrounded by Russian tanks, for instance, and we were besieged, how would we feed ourselves? If there were terrible earthquakes or storms and typhoons and things that affected us and cut off food supplies, if the national grid went down for whatever reason and food ran out for a while, how would we feed ourselves? And what would we know about the nutrition of that? These are the things that really interest me.
If people are inspired to dabble in foraging, I'm wondering if you've got a couple of tips around how to make sure they don't eat the wrong things that could be harmful, and also how to make sure they don't take too much.
Yes. Well, one of the best ways to learn is to actually go out with somebody who already knows what they're doing. There's only so much you can learn from a book. If you had never seen an iceberg lettuce or a Savoy cabbage before and had to identify them from a description in a book, you'd struggle. But instantly what they are. So the Association of Foragers lists about 180 people around the country who and Ireland and also in some of the European countries of people who are experienced in teaching this. And most people will run, short courses at weekends, go out in the different seasons and learn. And, if you're teaching yourself, maybe just start, instead of overloading yourself, just start with one species a week. Choose a new plant on a Sunday and just devote a week to it. By the end of 2 years, that's over 100 edible species that you would be able to know and recognize. And, that goes a long way.
Mo, what would be your dream world in terms of trees, nature, food? Can you paint a picture of how you'd like the future to be?
Yes. Gosh, well, it would be just lovely to see less destruction of the environment for sure. The way that the world is being paved over with concrete and asphalt is quite frightening, as we expand. And I suppose the sort of idyllic landscape would change depending on where you were living, but it would certainly have, plenty of trees and plenty of diversity and, different habitats to be in. But it's very like a question I ask people on my foraging walks once they've started to get to know a few things. And that's like, if you were on a magical desert island for the rest of your life that had a magical soil and climate where anything could grow, even if they don't normally grow together, what 10 plants, if you were just limited to 10, would you have on your island? And my first one would be a tree. It would be the coconut palm, because it is such an incredible example of a tree that gives us so much. You've got the nuts themselves, which will give you coconut flesh and the coconut milk. And did you know that coconut milk is actually the closest thing in nature to human plasma? And in hurricanes, people have even, used it instead of, plasma for IVs, when they've run out of human plasma. It's quite incredible. It gives you so much for building and thatching, whether you're building a raft or a hut. You can make cordage and string out of it. You can tap it for its sap, which will give you coconut sugar. There's so much, the shade and all the rest of it. And then when you go through that list of 10, there are other trees. If you want to have wild mushrooms on your island, you have to have trees because they live in partnership. And trees will also connect everything up through the mycelium and, continually replenish the soil and keep everything in balance and healthy.
Mo, I've learned so much speaking to you today, and I really hope we meet in person at some point because I've got a million more questions for you. But in rounding up this episode, I'm going to just ask you one more, and that is for you to think about what message you'd like to leave our listeners with.
Oh, I think when we look at the world around us, it's easy to understand or debate or argue about the logic of climate change and whether it exists or not and get lost in our heads. But for change to happen, we need the passion of our hearts, and we need to fall back in love with nature on a global scale. And the only way that you can love someone is to spend time with them. If you have a partner that you spend no time with, you fall out of love with very quickly. So get out, get into nature, go walking, rediscover the natural world around you. Because if we all do that, we'll make the difference.
You've been listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.